The footprints don't make sense. They lead across dry earth, through the remains of stone foundations, and down what was once the center of a quiet American town. But according to history, none of this should be here. These streets were supposed to be buried forever beneath the deep waters of Lake Mead. Yet today, when the lake retreats during years of severe drought, the forgotten town of St. Thomas, Nevada rises from the desert once again. Broken walls emerge from the mud. The outlines of homes become visible. The remains of a school, a church, and even a cemetery slowly return to daylight, as if time itself has been reversed. For thousands of visitors, it's an unforgettable sight. For historians, it's a rare opportunity to walk through a town that officially disappeared nearly a century ago. But for the families who once called this place home, these ruins are far more than abandoned buildings. Every cracked foundation marks a kitchen where meals were shared. Every empty street once echoed with children's laughter. Every stone carries a memory of people who believed they had built a future that would last forever. They were wrong. Because the greatest threat to St. Thomas didn't come from war. It didn't come from fire. And it didn't come from the unforgiving Nevada desert. Instead, it came from one of the greatest engineering achievements in American history, a project celebrated as a triumph of progress, while quietly condemning an entire town to disappear beneath the water. This is a true story of St. Thomas, the American town that vanished beneath a lake, and the astonishing reason it came back. Before St. Thomas became a ghost beneath the waters of Lake Mead, it was a promise carried into the Nevada desert by a small group of Mormon pioneers in the spring of 1865. They weren't searching for gold. They weren't chasing fame. They came with a far more difficult mission: to build a permanent community where, at first glance, no community should have survived. The muddy river valley was beautiful in a harsh and intimidating way. Rugged mountains surrounded the basin like silent walls. The river twisted through the desert, carrying life into a landscape dominated by heat, rock, and endless dust. During summer, the sun punished everything beneath it. Winter nights could be surprisingly cold. Flash floods arrived without warning, while long periods of drought tested every decision the settlers made. Most travelers looked at the valley and saw obstacles. The pioneers looked at the same land and saw opportunity. Their faith taught them that difficult places often demanded extraordinary determination. If water could be controlled, crops could grow. If crops could grow, families could survive. And if families could survive, a town could be born. That belief became the foundation of St. Thomas. The first months were relentless. Before sunrise, men walked into the fields carrying shovels, axes, and simple hand tools. Every irrigation canal had to be carved by hand. Every field had to be cleared stone by stone. There were no engines to make the work easier. Only determination, discipline, and a hope that their labor would give the next generation a better life. Women carried an equally demanding burden. They prepared food, cared for children, made clothing, gathered water, and often worked beside the men during planting and harvest. Every member of the settlement became part of the same struggle. Progress came slowly. The first successful harvest felt like a miracle. Simple adobe homes replaced temporary shelters. Fruit trees began taking root beside irrigation ditches. Small herds of cattle grazed near the river. The sound of children playing gradually replaced the silence that had once defined the valley. Against all expectations, St. Thomas wasn't merely surviving. It was beginning to thrive. No one could imagine that decades later, the greatest challenge facing the town would not come from the desert they had conquered, but from the water they believed would always keep it alive. For the next several decades, St. Thomas did something that many believed was impossible. It survived, not because life became easier, but because the people who lived there refused to surrender. Every season brought a new challenge. One year, the muddy river flooded without warning, tearing through irrigation ditches and washing away precious farmland. Another year, months of relentless heat baked the soil so hard that every bucket of water had to be measured carefully. Crops failed. Livestock died. Supplies arrived late, if they arrived at all. Yet every setback was met with the same quiet determination. The people rebuilt, again and again. Life in St. Thomas was never wealthy, but it was rich in something far more valuable: community. When a family needed help raising a barn, neighbors arrived before sunrise. When floods damaged the canals, the entire town worked side by side until the water flowed again. When harvest season came, everyone understood that one family's success meant food for the whole community. That spirit slowly transformed the settlement into a real town. A school opened its doors, giving children an education that many frontier communities could only dream about. A church became the heart of the town, not only for worship, but also for meetings, celebrations, and moments of comfort during difficult times. Small businesses appeared along the dusty streets. Blacksmiths repaired tools. General stores supplied daily necessities. Travelers passing through the muddy river valley began to recognize St. Thomas as an important stop in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Years turned into decades. Children who had once played beside newly planted orchards grew into adults and started families of their own. Some of the original pioneers grew old enough to watch their grandchildren harvest crops from fields they had carved out of the desert with their own hands. To them, St. Thomas was no longer an experiment. It was home. By the early 20th century, few people questioned whether the town had a future. If anything, the future looked brighter than ever. Across the American West, railroads expanded, new cities emerged, and technology promised opportunities that previous generations had never imagined. The people of St. Thomas believed they would be part of that future. They had earned it. After decades of sacrifice, they finally had stability. But history has a habit of changing lives without asking permission. Far beyond the muddy river valley, government officials, engineers, and politicians were discussing an ambitious project that would reshape the American Southwest forever. They spoke about electricity. They spoke about flood control. They spoke about progress. They never spoke about the families who would lose everything. Because on their maps, St. Thomas was little more than a name. For the people of St. Thomas, the future looked secure. They had survived droughts, floods, crop failures, and the isolation of the Nevada frontier. After decades of sacrifice, they believed the hardest years were finally behind them. But beyond the quiet fields of the muddy river valley, America was changing. The population of the Southwest was growing rapidly. Cities such as Los Angeles and Phoenix demanded more water than the Colorado River could reliably provide. Farmers wanted dependable irrigation. Engineers wanted to control destructive floods. Politicians saw an opportunity to transform the region through one bold project. The answer was a dam unlike anything America had ever attempted. For years, government engineers studied the Colorado River, searching for the perfect location. Their reports pointed toward Black Canyon, a narrow stretch of the river where an enormous concrete wall could hold back billions of gallons of water. In 1928, Congress passed the Boulder Canyon Project Act, authorizing construction of what would later become Hoover Dam. Across the country, newspapers celebrated the decision. They called it a victory for modern engineering, a solution to devastating floods, a source of electricity for millions, a project that would help pull America toward a new future. Very few people asked what would be sacrificed to make that future possible. As construction preparations began, federal survey teams spread across southern Nevada, carrying maps, measuring chains, notebooks, and surveying instruments. They walked through valleys that most Americans had never heard of. One of those valleys was home to St. Thomas. At first, the surveyors attracted little attention. The residents assumed they were simply collecting information for the new dam project many miles away. Then questions began spreading through town. Why were they measuring the elevation of streets? Why were they recording the height of buildings? Why were they marking homes, fields, and property lines? The answers arrived slowly, and they were devastating. The engineers had calculated the future shoreline of a vast new reservoir that would form behind Hoover Dam. According to their measurements, the rising waters would not stop at Black Canyon. They would continue north, past the desert hills, past the bends of the muddy river, until they reached St. Thomas itself. Silence replaced disbelief. For the first time since the town was founded in 1865, the people realized they were facing a disaster they could not fight with hard work, faith, or determination. The enemy was not nature. It was mathematics. Every calculation reached the same conclusion. Every survey confirmed the same reality. The town they had spent generations building had already been condemned. Not by war, not by disease, but by a line drawn across an engineer's map. And there was almost nothing they could do to stop it. No one could stop the water. Once Hoover Dam was completed, and its gates began holding back the Colorado River, Lake Mead started growing exactly as the engineers had predicted. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. Week after week, the shoreline crept forward. Month after month, the reservoir stretched deeper into valleys that had remained dry for centuries. For the people of St. Thomas, every passing season carried the same question. How much time do we have left? Families who had spent generations building their lives here were now forced to take them apart. Doors were removed from their hinges. Windows were carefully packed onto wagons and trucks. Farm equipment was sold, moved, or abandoned. Fruit trees that had taken years to mature would soon stand beneath rising water. Some residents dismantled entire houses, salvaging every board, every beam, and every nail they could reuse somewhere else. Others simply locked the front door one final time, knowing they would never return. The church that had witnessed weddings, funerals, baptisms, and countless Sunday gatherings fell silent. The school where children had once laughed through open windows closed forever. Even the cemetery demanded heartbreaking decisions. Families carefully exhumed the remains of loved ones and reburied them on higher ground, refusing to leave generations of memories beneath the lake. One by one, the streets became empty. The sound of wagons disappeared. The smoke no longer rose from kitchen chimneys. Fields that had once fed the town were left untouched. Then the water arrived. It moved quietly. There was no giant wave, no dramatic flood sweeping through the streets, only the slow, unstoppable advance of Lake Mead. Day after day, the shoreline crept closer. It reached the farms, then the roads, then the buildings. Stone foundations disappeared beneath dark water. The church vanished. Homes followed. Finally, by 1938, St. Thomas had disappeared beneath the surface of the largest reservoir in the United States. The town that had taken decades to build was erased in silence. Across America, Hoover Dam was celebrated as a miracle of engineering. Newspapers praised its power. Cities celebrated its electricity. Farmers welcomed its water. Very few people remember the small desert town that had paid the price. As the water settled above the rooftops, St. Thomas vanished from maps, from travel routes, and gradually from public memory. It seemed as though the desert had surrendered its town forever. But history wasn't finished yet, because nearly 70 years later, the lake itself would begin to reveal a secret no one expected to see again. For decades, St. Thomas existed only in memories. Boaters crossed the calm waters of Lake Mead without realizing that beneath them lay streets where children had once played, homes where families had celebrated birthdays, and fields that had once fed an entire community. The town had not been destroyed. It had simply been hidden. Year after year, Lake Mead remained high enough to keep St. Thomas out of sight. New generations grew up knowing Hoover Dam as an engineering masterpiece, but few knew the story of the town that disappeared to make it possible. Then nature changed the story. Beginning in the early 21st century, the American Southwest entered one of the most severe and prolonged droughts in its recorded history. Snowpacks in the Rocky Mountains shrank. Less water flowed into the Colorado River. At the same time, millions of people continued depending on that river for drinking water, agriculture, and electricity. The level of Lake Mead began to fall. At first, the change was gradual. A few meters of shoreline appeared. Then more. Year after year, the water continued retreating, exposing landscapes that had remained underwater for generations. And then, stone walls emerged from the mud. Fragments of foundations appeared beneath the desert sun. The outlines of old roads slowly became visible. St. Thomas was returning, not rebuilt, not restored, but revealed. Visitors who walked across the exposed lakebed described the experience as surreal. It felt less like exploring an abandoned town, and more like stepping into a forgotten chapter of American history. Some stood silently beside the ruins, imagining where families had once gathered for dinner. Others searched for locations marked in old photographs, comparing the past with what remained before their eyes. Archaeologists and historians welcome the rare opportunity to study structures that have been hidden beneath water for decades. Every exposed wall, every weathered stone, and every surviving foundation offered another piece of the town's remarkable story. But the return of St. Thomas carried a troubling message. The ruins were visible for only one reason. Lake Mead was shrinking. The same drought that uncovered the town also raised serious questions about the future of the Colorado River and the millions of people who depend upon it. What appeared to be a miracle was also a warning. The town had returned because the water that once buried it was disappearing. Today, if you stand among the ruins of St. Thomas, the silence feels almost impossible to describe. The wind moves through broken stone walls. Desert plants grow where living rooms once stood. The outlines of forgotten streets stretch across the dry lake bed, leading nowhere. Without knowing the history, you might believe these ruins belong to an ancient civilization, but they don't. This was an American town. Children once ran through these streets. Church bells once echoed across this valley. Farmers once believed the river beside them would secure their future. Instead, that future disappeared beneath a man-made lake. Yet, history is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. Hoover Dam transformed the American Southwest. It reduced destructive flooding, generated electricity, stored water for millions of people, and helped fuel the growth of cities that continue to thrive today. Those achievements are real, but so is the sacrifice that made them possible. St. Thomas reminds us that every great achievement has a human story hidden beneath it. Sometimes that story is written in celebration. Sometimes it is written in loss. The exposed foundations of this town are more than historic ruins. They are evidence that progress always asks a question: who benefits and who pays the price? As climate change, prolonged drought, and increasing demand continue to reshape the Colorado River, the story of St. Thomas feels more relevant than ever. The town that vanished beneath Lake Mead has become more than a forgotten chapter of history. It has become a warning, a reminder that nature, technology, and human ambition are forever connected, and that the decisions made today may shape landscapes, communities, and lives for generations to come. Perhaps that is why St. Thomas continues to rise from the lake, not because it refuses to disappear, but because history refuses to let us forget.